Hello and welcome to another episode of Intelligence for Your Life, the podcast. I'm Gib Gerard, a little under the weather if you can't tell from my voice, but I have a great show for you today. John not in the studio with me today, flying solo, but our guest today is Ravi Hutheesing. Ravi, this is one of my favorite conversations I've ever had. Not just, I know I say that a lot, but this is not just an interview. I like the ideas and stuff. This is the kind of coffee table discussions that I like to have in my real life. And Ravi delivers big time. So he has done so many different jobs. And we are going to talk about why he had to do so many different jobs and how he pivots from one job to the other. So he started off being the lead guitarist for Hanson. And we talk about how that led him to becoming a pilot, to becoming a cultural diplomat for the U.S. State Department. I mean, he does all kinds of stuff over his career, but it always pivots on certain parts of his life. And we talk about why we all have to be doing that now, why we need to be moving with, the old book, Who Moved My Cheese? That's what we discuss, where our cheese moves to and how we have to constantly be moving towards it and how to plan for that as we go into the future. This was very exciting for me. I can't even, it's so hard to do the intro right now because I can't distill down what we're about to talk about into something that's so simple that I can say it in an easy sentence. I had a hard time doing the write-up for this episode too. So just trust that if you are interested in things like the future of education, in things like finding your passion for what you work on and how to build a career around things that you're passionate about that you wouldn't necessarily know how to build a career on, that's what this conversation is about. So please enjoy my conversation with Ravi Hutheesing. Ravi Hutheesing, I can't even distill your resume down into a one-sentence intro. We're going to get into why that is in a minute, but thank you so much for being a part of our show today.
Oh, it's great to be here. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Okay, so now at this point, you are a keynote speaker on education and cross-culturalism. You are a cultural diplomat for the U.S. Department of State. You've founded your own schools. You've done all of these things, but you got a big start as the guitarist for Hanson.
Yeah.
Right?
Go figure.
I mean,
exactly.
How do you? First of all, kudos. I was a big fan, and anybody that says they weren't is lying because Hanson was fantastic. I mean, I still dance to Mbop. I'm just going to put that out there. If it comes on, I'm still dancing.
Well, that's good.
So how do you make that transition? You were born into a political family. How did you say, Mom, Dad, I'm going to go off and I'm going to be a guitarist for a teen pop band?
Yeah, it's so funny when I look back at that trajectory, and I talk about it in my keynotes, because one of the main themes that I talk about is the importance of being able to pivot in life. Mm-hmm. And that's really how you continuously reinvent yourself. And for me, it started even in some ways before I was born, because my dad pivoted from his own family. Now, I come from a political family, the first family of India. My great uncle was the architect of the world's largest democracy, Jawaharlal Nehru. And my father grew up in a family that was, very much involved and consumed with the fight for India's independence. Mm-hmm. And so his childhood was a big part of that. But then he decided that he wanted to become a businessman, and he pivoted himself and immigrated to the United States and became one of the first Indians on Wall Street. Now, I have two older brothers that followed in his footsteps. So you can imagine it was, for me to depart from that line of what was first politicians and then became investment bankers was kind of, it was a tough thing to do because it was just very different than anything that I'd known about. But when I was 11 years old, my brothers went off to college, and my parents' marriage started to fall apart, and I got lost. And it was in that process of getting lost that I found myself. And I found myself in the arts and in music. And as strange as it probably was when, all I wanted to do was be Angus Young of AC/DC while I came from this more corporate family, I think in some weird ways my dad respected it because he had also made that departure from his own family.
Interesting.
So he recognized that I was going to chart my own course. And while he made me work hard to earn his support, I did earn his support, and he gave it to me. And so, when I I got my first guitar when I was 11 years old, and I was able to build a recording studio in my mother's basement before I graduated high school. And I had this business going, and I had clients coming in and out recording. I had a teaching business going on. As soon as I, knew how to play guitar well enough, I started teaching. And as it turned out, one of those studio clients that was recording in my mother's basement, well, he got a really cool gig some years later being the musical director for Vanessa Williams.
Wow.
And so he wasn't recording at my mother's basement anymore, and I
Mm-hmm.
actually lost touch with him. But what I did do was send out a bunch of Christmas cards one year in December of 1996. And in February of 1997, somebody asked him if he knew of a young guitar player for a band they were trying to launch, an unknown band at the time. And he had just gotten a Christmas card for me. So he referred me for this gig. And it was one gig with the band at the time. We didn't know it was going to become anything big, but it immediately became something big. And then I was hired for the rest of the year to tour with Hanson. And it was only a few months later that we had number one hits, and we're outselling every other band on the planet. So that's how that whole thing happened.
That's incredible. What I love too is that this is your. I mean, look, kudos to you for charting your own path and for doing that. But also, you talk about earning your dad's support. The rebellion of going into music involved creating a business of running your own recording studio in the process. So I have to say kudos to your family for ingraining in you a certain amount of business acumen, so that like, yeah, I'm going to be a musician, but I'm not going to be a starving artist. I am going to find a way to make it a business right away. I'm going to find this is the quickest path to profitability.
No, exactly. And even he made me write a business plan when I was a teenager. And that was probably one of the greatest lessons that anybody could have ever taught me. And to this day, it is, given me a foundation for being an entrepreneur and constantly pivoting and building my business.
Do you think that there's value? I hear it kind of in your voice that there's value in writing a business plan for every aspect of our life.
I think, planning is really good, but nothing's written in stone. I mean, these plans always have to be flexed. But the act of actually sitting down and charting your course, I'm a pilot too. So from a pilot perspective, I always think about how important it is to chart your course to your destination and to constantly monitor that you are on that course and that you are going toward your destination. And you know what? If the winds change or something changes, well, then you've got to have alternate airports and you have to have another plan.
Right.
And to me, that's the plan for life. And so whether it's a business plan or whether it's a pilot's flight plan, all of these things are tried and true methods on how to have a good plan for achieving your goals and living your dreams and having, a successful life by whatever measure you choose to use to determine what success is.
That's great advice. Obviously, like the idea of needing the alternate airports is a great metaphor. But how do you start to do that in a world that also encourages people to be singularly minded and focused? Because like that's the billionaire founder mentality, are these hyper focused individuals who succeed at all costs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's partly true, but also when we really look at people like, a Richard Branson, for example, I mean, this is a guy that has branched out in lots of different directions. This is a guy that sees an opportunity and goes for it, and he's not afraid to fail. And I've always admired that and tried to have that same mentality. We have, in a sense, a education system, and we have a society that honors that focus and that tried and true determination on a single path. But it's also changing. I mean, our education system has to get away from teaching achievement and has to teach people to fail. I mean, that's part of what I talk about in my education keynotes is we all know that failure is just the stepping stones towards success. And it's extremely important to give kids that grit and that perseverance in order to have the courage to fail and broaden their horizons, because it's that broadening of horizons and spectrum of experiences that make a complete human being. And in my opinion, that's the pathway to success. Again, however an individual defines it. But if the more experiences you have in life, the more opportunities you have to combine those experiences and ultimately pivot as needed.
How do you know when to pivot? Because it sounds great on paper, like this idea of yeah, okay, well, that's not working out. Then I moved to this. But how do you know when to make that change? And also how it seems like you've used your previous experiences to inform your future experiences, and that's great. But a lot of people would say, okay, you were a guitar player for a pop rock group. Uh, how do you pivot out of that? Like the first thing that I heard from you, which I think is a really important one, which is never burn bridges, maintain your contacts, and because every contact could come back and be valuable in the future, which I think is great advice to begin with. But how do I know when to pivot?
Yeah, so to add to that advice, it really comes down to social skills. It's broader than that. One has to be able to. Social skills are so important. One has to be able to go up to a stranger and have a conversation, and be able to communicate your passion and your interests in life in a short amount of way that makes you an interesting person, and also be genuinely curious enough about other people so that you can learn from them and discover and build your network. Right? They say your net worth is your network. So networking and social skills are a really important part of that. But so when do you know how to pivot? Well, there's at least two set of circumstances that have always guided me on that. One is when everything collapses. So going back to Hanson.
That's the obvious one. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was in 1997. In 1999, everything collapsed. The record industries, the entire model changed because we went to peer-to-peer networks and a sharing economy when the internet really started to dominate our lives at that point. And the record companies didn't know how to do it. And all of our contracts were put on the shelf, and everything was gone. I mean, everybody that I was trying to network with and build, who I thought would make my solo career happen, they were out looking for jobs, and they were even calling me and asking if I knew anybody. So that was my first sign of, well, I got to pivot. I mean, there's nowhere for me to climb here. So what am I going to do? And that's when I got into writing for music magazines and talking about my experiences, and that's when my public speaking began as well, because I started talking about what it was like to go from the middle of nowhere to the top of the world in the big machine music business, and then how do we do it as artists, entrepreneurs now. That's how my speaking career started. That was my first pivot. My second big pivot was in 2008 when the economy crashed, and I no longer had any endorsement deals. I no longer had any clients that wanted to hire me to speak. The magazine industry was going the way of the record industry, so they weren't paying me to write articles. That time I pivoted in such an extreme way, and I said, you know what, I've already done it twice in the music industry, once with the big labels, the other as an independent. I'm going to try to do something completely different, follow my other passion in life, and I became a pilot. That's what led me into the aviation industry. And I didn't decide to do that as a profession. I decided to just do that as sort of personal growth. But what I discovered was that there was a shrinking pilot population. The aviation industry didn't know how to attract the millennial generation. And I had just come out of, a band that was the birth of the millennial generation. I kind of understood how that generation ticked. The other thing that I discovered at that time was that millennials said that their number one priority was music. Well, I had a music background. And then the third thing I discovered at that time was that half of the pilot population plays a musical instrument. It's one of the largest crosses. The general population, only 8% claim that they play a musical instrument. But in aviation, it's 49.7%.
That's crazy.
So that was my way of pivoting my interest in aviation into a business. And I started keynote speaking in aviation as an aviation speaker to help the aviation industry recruit the millennial generation. So that first pivot that I talked about was out of necessity because the music industry collapsed under me. This pivot was out of opportunity because I was able to connect some dots, and I saw, okay, now I can actually build a business in aviation. And that was the same story of when I gave my first keynote speech in Moscow, and I discovered that the cultural attaché for the U.S. Embassy in Moscow was giving a speech the day before me, and I decided, well, I might as well go there and see what he has to say.
Right.
And afterwards, I used my social skills to talk to him, and 6 months later, he invites me back as a cultural diplomat for the U.S. Department of State to start giving speeches on back to artist entrepreneurship. So that's the third big pivot that I made, was getting into the global realm and actually doing something on a diplomacy basis. But here's what's interesting. If you look at all three of those pivots, one first out of necessity, the second two out of opportunity, the pivot point on which I pivoted was music. in every single one of
Mm.
those. And that's the key in terms of helping people learn how to pivot, is you have to find your pivot point. And then you can pivot, through lots of different things in life.
Wow. So you basically you find this thing that is your passion, and then you find ways to pivot around it so that you can use that passion to inform new money making opportunities or new career opportunities. We'll call it, because it's not just about the money, but it's about finding ways to monetize your life essentially.
Right. I think there's a few things to combine here. I mean, when you have those social skills and you talk to people, you all of a sudden start seeing opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
When what you're about, which is that pivot point, you find ways then to connect your pivot point to those opportunities
Mm-hmm.
and to make it happen. And then this goes back to what we began talking about, the business plan. That is nothing in stone. When I wanted to be Angus Young of AC/DC, there was nowhere in that business plan did it say cultural diplomat,
Right,
U.S.
right, right,
Department.
right, right, right. Exactly. Yeah. No, it didn't. What?
Believe it or not, no.
Yeah.
So so that's the point, is it's really good to have vision, but you also have to remain flexible so that you can capitalize on opportunities, but also make a change when things don't go as planned.
And in it, I mean, what was your, aside from just making money, was it just the idea that, okay, here I can influence culture in a way around me that and still make the music the core of it? Was that the goal? I mean, like, what was
Well,
your motivating
absolutely.
factor for finding these new
I mean,
things?
I'm doing, working in for the State Department or as a client or doing anything in public service is not for the money.
Right,
Um,
right.
because it's public money. So it's just not there. That's not the way you make money, but that is the way you make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what it was for me, is to have global experience, learn more about cultures myself, and to use my skills and everything that I've built to that point to try to have a positive impact on the world. And that started in Russia with the artist entrepreneurship lectures, but it
Right.
evolved into something far more beautiful for me, which is creating songwriting workshops around the world that bring together people from traditionally opposed cultures and religions. And I launched that first one with the State Department in Indonesia, where I had
Wow.
Muslims, Buddhists, and Christians writing songs together for 2 weeks and falling in love with each other and building lifelong friendships.
Wow.
And I mean, it's amazing. It was just absolutely amazing. And the next year, I did it in Iraq with Iraqis and Kurds, and then in Lebanon with Lebanese and Syrians. And right now, I'm talking to you from Chile, where everything is falling apart here in this country with social unrest. And I'm launching one of these programs with the indigenous and non-indigenous communities to come together and write music together for 2 weeks in February.
That's amazing. I mean, I also think that's one of the important values of the arts that's been really lost in how the business has sort of changed around the arts. But like in other words, education right now, specifically in the United States, they keep de-emphasizing the arts and focusing on math and English, which I think is very important. But music and enrichment, like you brought up earlier, I'm connecting a few dots here, so it's going to take a second.
Yeah.
But you brought up earlier how all of these pilots are also musicians. Well, I believe wholeheartedly that there is an inherent understanding of mathematics that's required for music. Even if you don't realize you're doing math, you're constantly
Right.
doing math, and you're translating from symbols into something else in a way that becomes the symbols begin to move through your body when you're reading music in a way that is very similar to how driving a car or piloting a plane. You're taking in a lot of inputs, and your brain is just finding flow, and you are dynamically interpreting that input into essentially music, which is playing the airplane just like you would an instrument. And I think that there's a lot of correlation there, and I think music is a great way of unlocking that part of the brain, and it's something that I think we're losing, particularly in Western society, in the eyes of sort of utilitarian education. And I'm saddened by that, but I'm amazed that you're finding ways to use it and to use the arts to connect people, to say something about society. Like just the idea of people from different backgrounds in Indonesia sitting down and writing songs together is such a beautiful way to create art together. Really does help you see from each other's perspective. That's the goal of art. And I really want to hear this music that's being written from these different cultural perspectives, because I think in that music is an inherent understanding that we can all have for how to come together.
Well, absolutely. And, it just comes down to empathy. I mean, the arts is the best
Right,
way.
right.
Empathy. And if we are going to create global citizens who are culturally competent, and that's one of the big topics I talk about is cultural competency as a pathway to equity in education. If we create culturally competent students,
Mm,
then they have a much greater opportunity to not only be global citizens, but to be global leaders and business,
right,
whether it's business leaders or political leaders. And the pathway to that level of empathy is through the arts.
right.
There's no substitute.
Yeah, and look, what a great way to develop a shorthand early on. Because look, the economy is global, and that's not going to change. So if you really want to be a leader, you're going to have to deal with people from diverse backgrounds. That's just the reality of the world we live in. Whether you think that's good or not, I think it's good. But whether you think it's good or not, that's reality. And the arts is such a great method for finding the empathy required to do that. Like, I really believe that everybody should be studying and participating in artistic expression from multiple cultures at this point.
Well, absolutely. Until let's take it one step further. I mean, PricewaterhouseCoopers tells us that nearly 40% of jobs are going to be automated in the next 10
Right,
years.
right,
So today we all talk, we kind of we self-identify and identify others with what we do. But
right.
what if that changes? What are we going to identify with as a society? How do we not become disaffected? And I believe it's because we have to be connected culturally
Mm,
to ourselves and to each other. That's how we avoid disaffection. That's how we reduce radicalization, and that's how we create. Well, let's just say it. That's how we work towards world peace.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
that's really the bottom line. And you're right. This is a global economy, but what's also so interesting about it is, really going back to the sharing economy and the internet in 1999. What's happened now is we're no longer a vertical trickle up or trickle down economy. We are lateral sharing,
right,
peer to peer economy. And so I often say world peace is possible if we make it profitable. But
right.
what I really,
True. It's so true.
right,
Yeah,
right, but but I think it already is profitable because we are in this lateral sharing
yeah.
economy, and so that means that it's profitable for us to all get along.
One of the things that happens when resources become scarcer is that the competition for resources begins to rise up. So the music industry has always been cutthroat, but as profits shrink, the handful of artists that are profitable become these commodities that are fought over, and their catalogs are sued over. Everybody becomes more litigious, which is the version of wars in the arts or in that world. So how do we, as populations rise and resources become scarce, including monetary and physical resources, how do we find that peace despite that fact? Because I'll even go one step further, and I'll circle back to the question. We saw it happen with the music business, where people were prioritizing music, but they weren't paying for it. So all of a sudden, the business model collapses. We see that happen with publishing. Like, people are consuming more news now than they ever have. People are consuming more music and media than they ever have. It's just that the monetization model has shifted to the point where kind of nobody except for Disney knows how to make money off of their stuff anymore.
Right.
And yet consumption is way up. Well, we're seeing the same thing happen in actual manufacturing. Consumption
Yep.
of manufactured goods is going way up, but nobody knows how to make money manufacturing goods in Western countries anymore. We outsource all of it, or we automate all of it. It's a wild thing that we're dealing with right now. How do we maintain peace as competition for resources increases?
Yeah. Well, I mean, boy, I wish I had the answer for that, right?
Right? Yeah.
but but I'd shed a little light on it by looking at things like, where we had, what are those jobs of the future, what are those industries of the future, and renewable energy is certainly one of them. And when you look at something like fossil fuels, right, we have to mine it and refine it. It's expensive. It's inefficient to
Hmm.
do that. And I don't say this as taking a political platform. I'm looking at it just from an economic point of view.
Right.
And but when you look at the sun, it just keeps giving and giving and giving, and it's free for everybody to take once you have the initial investment, right, of your
Right.
solar panels or whatever it is that are coming down. So what happens? Well, that's decentralization, and that's something that big corporations are afraid of. But once I have a solar panel on my roof, for example, I'm not dependent on a big energy company.
Hmm.
I'm not dependent on any of those things. So those resources become less scarce because people start to tap into resources
Mm.
on a decentralized level. Another good example is network neutrality. If we are able to achieve network neutrality, the access to the internet really democratizes knowledge,
Yeah.
and that empowers more people from regardless of socioeconomic um, standing,
Right.
regardless of what your classification is. So, network neutrality is another one of those major opportunities in the future that decentralizes and democratizes some of the most important things that we have, like knowledge. And then you can look into even things like 3D printing, where people can start printing products at home, and that just changes the whole
Yeah.
form of how we distribute things and create things. So, in economic theory, all that's called zero marginal cost. Things where we're reducing our cost of manufacturing and decentralizing where that manufacturing happens. And then all of a sudden you realize that we're actually not that short on a lot of resources.
Mm. How do we make money in that future?
Well, yeah, that is a great
I mean, are we all should we all
that's
vote for Andrew Yang because that's the only way to keep the economy going?
so we could keep getting a handout. No, I mean, I
I'm
think
not endorsing a political candidate. I was being, and you seem to get the joke, but for the audience,
no, of
I'm
course.
just saying he has he calls it the freedom dividend, which is just the universal basic
Exactly.
income concept.
Right. So I actually do believe that's a real possibility. I do believe that a UBI is actually a possibility when artificial intelligence is going to be generating revenue, and therefore our GDP will go up at the same time as unemployment, which has
Right.
never happened.
Right.
So, but that's what we're setting up for now. And a lot of people find that are horrified by that, but I just see this as a great opportunity, because what it also does is it releases a tremendous amount of human capital to do beautiful things
Hmm.
as opposed to menial jobs. So just imagine that. Okay, if we have a UBI and people are making money, and instead of going to work at jobs that they're not happy with, and are wearing them out and doesn't give them time with their kids, if we instead have a society that has time to spend time with their kids, raising their kids, and make beautiful music, amongst other things, might that be a better society than a stressed one that's really struggling to make money? All that becomes possible when we have this decentralization and this democratization of things. Is it a good thing? Does society work well like that?
I
We
don't
don't really
know.
know.
Yeah.
That's why many European countries have been experimenting with UBI to see how people react. And that's why I have this conversation with educators. This is my keynote, because we have to prepare society, and the future leaders for this type of society, because it's very possible that that's what we'll have. And I see it as a huge opportunity if we do it right.
Yeah. I mean, that brings up another issue, which is how do we pivot, right? Like how does an individual who defines him or herself by their job title and by their accomplishments pivot to a world where we're much less accomplishment focused, and where, like you say, this odd utopia where AI serves a good amount of our needs. Our production, the overall production of society goes up, but yet the need for human capital in that process goes down. How do we define ourselves? How do we make that pivot? And that's tricky.
And that gets right back to culture, and getting back in touch with our own culture, cultural competence, which means being
Mm-hmm.
able to understand other people's culture.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, it's the question I ask my audiences all the time in my keynotes: what are we educating for? What becomes the purpose of education? And it goes back to that idea of creating a peaceful world and a peaceful society. I mean, as sort of trite or as that might sound, what greater mission is there in life than for us all to get along
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
together as a world? It doesn't have to be so ethereal or so impractical, because it actually is becoming practical.
See, and you believe it's possible? Because there's a lot of people
Well,
out there, naysayers, who would say this is great. We can all sit around and sing "Kumbaya" together, but
yeah,
there
exactly.
there are some irreducible elements of this idea of getting along.
Absolutely. And one of the things I often say, especially around circles of friends, is I'm trying to put this. That's why I say world peace is possible if we make it profitable.
Right.
It's not a kumbaya concept. It's actually economic theory in a sharing economy, and that's what makes me believe that it's possible. Um, that's what makes me believe that it's possible in the sense of from an economic and political point of view. What makes me believe it's possible from a human point of view is when I have Muslims, Christians, and Buddhists writing songs together for
Right.
2 weeks,
Right.
Iraqis and Kurds, or Russians and Ukrainians, or Mapuche tribe Chileans and non-indigenous Chileans. When I see these people who have been fighting all the time come together through something as simple as creating a song together and building long friendships. I mean, friendships that exist online, for through chat groups for years, and then when they go to each other's countries again, or to each other's parts of their countries, they get together and they write songs in person. When I see that, I not only do I know that people want to live in peace,
Mm.
but that's what shows me that it's possible. And it's really that's again why I focus so much on the education industry, because I believe that education is the driver of that opportunity.
Can you get capitalists and communists to sit down and do the same thing?
Yeah, I'm really trying to be honest, and that's what's so interesting too here, and that's why I'm studying this whole situation in Chile, because you look at what's going on in Hong Kong right now, you look at what's going on here in Chile, you look at what's going on in Iran, you look at what's going on in Lebanon, you
Right.
look at what's going on in Venezuela, Bolivia. I mean, you pick it; it's happening all over the world right now, at the same time. And it's the same issues. It's the youth around the world that are rising up against inequality, against overpriced healthcare, against poor education.
Mm-hmm.
They're all fighting on with the same argument. What's so interesting is Hong Kong, they're fighting against a communist government in Beijing. In Chile, here, they're fighting against a capitalist government.
Mm-hmm.
In
That's that
Bolivia,
pure.
they're
That's that
fighting
pure
against
capitalism. The Chile has that pure free market that is sort of imploding on itself right now. Just for
yeah,
yeah,
neoliberalism.
yeah.
It's neoliberalism. Exactly. That's exactly what it is. And it's and I just wrote a blog, on my website. I write a blog every month. And the one that came out 2 days ago, I wrote from here: is capitalism failing? Because we always talk about how socialism has failed, and there are many reasons why it has, multitude of reasons why it has. But can capitalism fail as well? And I think I'm witnessing it here.
Yeah.
So I think it is, and if we know that this is the youth rising up on these issues, and they're rising up against capitalist neoliberal governments, and they're rising up against communist governments, yes, I think capitalists and communists can eventually get along,
Yeah.
because the problems are the same, and we all have to come together to create some sort of peace amongst different generations and different cultures.
Well, I mean, capitalism also will fail when we get to that area that we were talking about before, where it begins to eat its own tail, where it's producing goods and services for an economy, and it's optimizing. The firm is optimizing itself by not paying its workers enough to actually consume the goods and services generated by the economy.
Right,
And,
exactly.
and so that's where capitalism begins to eat its own tail and collapses on itself.
I
Capitalism.
mean,
Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say I call it a false middle class.
Right.
Capitalism has brought a lot of poverty, people out of poverty and into middle class. But that middle class is carrying the heaviest debt load
Mm-hmm.
of any segment of society, and that's what collapsed in 2008 in the mortgage crisis. That's what's going to collapse now through student loans and education debt
Mm-hmm.
uh, and healthcare costs. And it is that middle class that isn't really. I mean, I don't know how we can call it an economically sound middle class if uh, if predatory lending has put them in such a situation where they have so much debt.
Right. Right. It's a good point, and so that's why I've seen economic theory change from a purely like there were two worlds of thought where there was like purely centrally planned and purely free market, and now it seems like the prevailing wisdom is that there is some middle point where the economy is optimized, some sort of curve where it's not purely centrally planned, but it's also not allowing capitalism to be the only moral argument.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I mean, capitalism has served me well. I mean, that's how I built my
Right,
business,
right.
and I believe in the fundamentals of capitalism for sure. I don't believe in neoliberalism. I believe in the socially responsible components of socialism, but I don't believe necessarily in, other aspects of
Right, right,
socialism,
right.
or certainly that would lead to an extreme of communism, and the vulnerabilities of that. So, I think that there's something else altogether that we ought to be focusing
Right.
on. And it comes back down to the idea of a decentralized sharing economy, which
Hmm.
is rooted in capitalism more than anything else, but organically has a socially responsible component to it.
Right. I think we kind of agree on a certain element. Like I often say when having these discussions that capitalism is like capitalism exists whether we like it or not, or whether we are in a purely unplanned, unregulated economy, or if you're in a fully regulated economy. Like you saw it in the 80s during the Cold War with the price of Levi's among people behind the Iron Curtain. Right, there was
Yep.
a market for certain goods and services that existed, whether that centrally planned economy accepted it or not.
Mhm.
And capitalism had these little footholds, so it exists whether we like it or not. It's just as a society, do we decide that we need to motivate the market to an equilibrium point that serves more people than just the firms that are operating in that marketplace?
Right,
Uh,
exactly, and I think if we're going to create a sustainable economy as our population grows, and as Asian countries especially start to dominate. I mean, look at India that has 500 million at or below the poverty level,
right,
depending on what number you believe, a significant amount.
right.
And I would do work over there with the impoverished. It's a significant that is a significant tax on the global society that we are going to have to pay one way or the other.
We have gotten so far afield, and I've loved every second of it, but we've gotten so far afield. I want to ask you a question that I think that will help recenter us. Because what I'm hearing from you, and what I believe too as well, is that the pivot is the new normal. It's no longer are we getting a job for Ma Bell, working for 40 to 50 years and retiring with a gold watch and a golden parachute pension. That just doesn't exist anymore, and it probably in that the churn rate of jobs and career concepts is just the churn rate's just increasing. Jobs are disappearing and recreating and remolding faster than they ever have been, and I think that pace is just going to increase. My question, I guess, is your pivots make so much sense in hindsight. They're almost like when you describe them, like, wow, that's incredibly creative of you, but also a foregone conclusion. Like that makes sense. Why do so many of us, and how do we start to make it easier, struggle with being able to pivot ourselves? Like why do we not throw? Why can't we pivot?
Right. So this is my I'm writing a book right now. It'll come out next year. It's called Pivot, and it's just about this concept that you're asking. So I appreciate that. But yes, my trajectory makes so much sense, but only in hindsight. I mean, if I had told
Right.
my father the business plan, he would have said, "You're crazy. This doesn't make any sense." And
I'm going to
and
be a guitarist for the biggest band in the world, and then I'm going to start giving keynote speeches about the importance of music and cultural, and then I'm going to become a pilot. And like, okay,
yeah, exactly.
sound like an
But
8 year old drawing on his notebook.
so it's so true. It's exactly what it's like. It wouldn't make any sense,
Yeah.
but it makes a lot of sense when you reverse engineer it, because you can see the pivot points. That's really the thing, is those pivot points.
Mm.
So, yes, I agree with everything that you just said. People are going to have to pivot. This is the future. We are moving into somewhat of a, gig economy style of careers, as
Yeah.
opposed to working for a company for 30 years with a pension there.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other things that to consider, which is the director of the lab on aging at Harvard Medical School says that the first person to live to 150 has already been born.
Wow.
Now, if we look at it that way, I mean, think of how many different careers you're going to want to have, maybe different industries you're going to want to have,
Mm-hmm.
maybe multiple marriages. I mean, is life getting longer and longer? Who knows how many different things one will want to take on throughout the course of a lifetime. And again, in my keynote, so I talk to educators. How are we going to educate someone in 12 years or 16 years, 18 years, 20 years for 100 years of productivity? in
Right.
150 years.
Yeah. How did Methuselah do it?
Yeah, well, I mean, and the way to do it, and this goes right back to the point of pivoting. The way to do it is to only focus on teaching students basically one thing, which is how to be a lifelong learner, because they're going to have to
Right.
teach themselves
Right.
through the rest of their lives. And if they do that, they can constantly pivot. And that's the key, lifelong learning.
Yeah.
The job of school is it's not to disseminate knowledge, because the knowledge is in the palm of our hands in our cell phones.
Right.
It's to make kids curious enough, give them the data triangulation, critical thinking skills enough to evaluate what they discover, and the confidence to go out there and apply it.
That is amazing, true, and so much harder than making people memorize state capitals. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
how do you write a curriculum for? Hey, we want to make sure that every student that goes through our school system of 50 million kids walks out and is able to have a passion and an ability to learn for themselves and think critically for the rest of their lives.
right. So the keys to that are, number one, we have to get away from standardized testing, absolutely, and maybe even to some degree grading and summative assessments, which is basically grading, and move into much more formative style of assessing student progress, teaching failure. Go back to that.
Some
If we can
model-based,
encourage
project-based
fail-
learning instead of
project-based learning, yeah, and the cultural competence piece. Another thing I do we didn't talk about is I have a network of 150 international schools. It's called Ravi Unites Schools, and what I do with these schools is I create these 45-minute online student interactions with one classroom in one country and another classroom in another country, and I just host an interaction and basically facilitate a conversation that is based on the questions that the students want to ask each other. And that type of peer-to-peer learning on a global level
mm-hmm.
is really, really powerful.
Yeah.
And I have teachers tell me all the time afterwards, my kids learn more in that 45 minutes than they've learned in a month in my classroom.
Right.
And,
The kind of learning that
that's
we
how
need, the kind of learning that we're going to need too.
exactly, because they're learning from each other and it's self-directed learning. We talk about things like personalized learning and stuff like that, but the key to all of it is self-directed learning, because they have to be lifelong learners. So we just have to teach them to educate themselves
Yeah.
throughout life.
I mean, easier said than done. you know,
Of
but
course,
yes, but
that's
you're
a
right.
big vision.
That's the only future.
Yeah. And, yes, it's easier said than done. But if we do change our measurement systems and we change our standardized testing and our especially in the United States, our absolute love for testing, which we really have to get away from, because that teaches achievement, doesn't teach failure. And we really give students a much bigger opportunity to do these project-based learning. It's pretty organic. It
Mm-hmm.
actually really is. And teachers have to stop thinking of themselves traditionally as teachers and start thinking of themselves as coaches or facilitators.
Mm.
Because the students will do the work and they'll stay curious, and they will, if it's self-directed, they will discover how they can teach themselves for the rest of their lives.
And that's ultimately what we need. Our guest today, Ravi Hutheesing. You are an international education speaker and cross-cultural catalyst. You can follow up if you have a business and you want Ravi to have this kind of conversation with your people. RaviUnites.com is a place to get started. Ravi, where else can people follow up with you?
Anywhere on social media, my handle on everything is at Ravi Unites. But otherwise, through the website is the best way. And I've got my blog there, so they can sign up right there and keep in touch with me. And they can email me directly through the website too. And I spend a lot of time on airplanes, and a lot of that time I spend answering emails. So I'm happy to do it.
Links to all of his social media accounts in the show notes, as well as a link to the website. And again, this is the kind of discussion that every organization needs to be having. So whether you own a regional dry cleaner or a multinational corporation, go ahead and click that link and get Ravi to come in and talk to you. One last thing, and I ask it to everybody, Ravi, what is one thing we can all start doing today to make our lives a whole lot better?
I think kindness, just one kind action towards somebody else, that really does begin to change the world and change the way that we see each other, and to really start bridging those generational and cross-cultural things. And I would say kindness that does bridge a generation. A kid should go up and talk to an adult. An adult should go up and talk to a kid, and also talk to somebody that looks different than you. It's all about conversation and crossing those perceived barriers to realize that we all have more in common than we have differences. So just go up and talk to somebody that you wouldn't normally do.
There you have it. Ravi, thank you so much for your time today, and I hope you'll come back when you release your book.
I appreciate it, Gib. Thanks so much.
Well, that's it for our show today. I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. If you really like the show, please rate, comment, and subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us out a lot. Also, if you like this episode, please share it with a friend that you think would enjoy it. It makes a huge difference for us and our bottom line. If you want to follow up with us, Facebook.com/John Tesh is where we spend most of our time. John is also on Twitter @John Tesh, on Instagram @JohnTesh_IFYL. I am Gib Gerard. You can find me at Facebook.com/Gib Gerard or at Gib Gerard on Instagram and Twitter. Our show today was written and produced by me, Gib Gerard, produced by Chrissy Wallen, who does all of our booking of our guests. She's amazing. Chrissy, thank you. Executive producer is John Tesh.